There's a whole host of ways that you could be inadvertently causing damage to your mountain bike. Trust me, I've done a few of them in my time, and some of those unfortunately turned out to be irreparable. I had to spend a little bit of cash to sort it out, and that's how it is sometimes. However, I want to think today, what can we do to bring some of these back from the brink, maybe avoid them in the future, and make those repairs that can save your bike. If you've been out for a ride and your bike's maybe not absolutely filthy, it's true, it doesn't necessarily need a full strip down and clean, but particularly in the winter, it's really important to avoid leaving it wet for too long, because anything ferrous-based, any steel components, they can rust really easily. Maybe you don't see it underneath the dirt, but once it's taken hold, it's very difficult to shift that rust. This is particularly important for drivetrain components like chains, which, because they tend to be a bit greasy, a bit of lube and dirt on them, it can be hard to see if it's rusting, but really making sure it's dry, cleaned, and you can use a water displacement product to really make sure it's dried off before you reapply lube after a clean, because what you don't want to do is stack that stuff on top of some moisture. It traps it in and really just locks in the rust. As well as the chain, it's important to think about where you store your bike. In the past, maybe I was storing my bike in a shed, outside somewhere. It can be dry when you put it away, but that shed is maybe drafty, it might have tiny little holes in it, moisture's getting in, and if you leave your bike too long, it just seems to be wet again. So just trying to keep on top of that as much as possible is super important for preventing that rust from setting in. If you're casing jumps and putting your bike through a lot of those heavy, square-edged, hard impacts, there's always a risk of turning that back wheel into a tacho. The way to avoid this really is to keep your spokes nice and evenly tensioned. Once you have a bit of uneven tension in that wheel, some of the spokes are way more likely to work their way loose, make the whole wheel more weaker, more baggy, and more at risk of folding in half. You don't necessarily need a wheel stand for this. You can have the bike up in a work stand, or just have the wheel off and maybe on your knees, and then you can work your way around, checking all the spokes for even tension, and sort of listening to the noise and just working out which ones are, if any, are really loose. If you do find the loose, baggy spokes, I sort of want to match the tension of the spokes around them if I'm doing it by feel, to sort of just even it up. So I don't want to affect the wheel being straight too much, but you can tell if a spoke is really loose and it's wobbling around in the wheel. You just do a few turns of the spoke key, bring it up to around the spokes around it, and then it kind of removes that weak point from the wheel. Using the wrong tools for the job is, I think, one of the easiest ways to cause damage to your bike, or really anything else. There's a lot of stuff that you maybe encounter in day-to-day life where adjustable spanners and stuff like that, they are really useful, but for precision engineered products, like a lot of the stuff you get on bikes, it really is important to have the right thing. One of the things we see a lot where people, they may be using an adjustable spanner where they shouldn't be, is on the top cap of an air fork air chamber. There's some really delicate, shallow aluminium flats, and if you do use a spanner on them, it's almost guaranteed it's going to slip and damage that cap. For cases like this fork air chamber top cap, it's really important to have the right size socket and the right type of socket. Because the area where you get a purchase on this cap is so shallow, the flats are so small, it's important to have a flat edge socket as opposed to a chamfered edge one that fits on a lot of different other bolts you might see on engines and stuff like that. This, with the sharp corners of the flat edge, actually make a full purchase with the shallow edges on this nut, and that means you're not going to slip and cause it to round. We hammer home about doing regular bolt checks all the time, I think, and that's because it's so important, like not only for causing injuries to you, but it can really damage your bike. So things like maybe your pedals have worked slightly loose in the crank arm, that can absolutely ruin the threads. Your cranks have come loose, that can ruin the bottom bracket. If you have play in your headset because the stem has come a bit loose, that will wear out the headset bearings and therefore the frame much quicker. There's almost anything like really needs to be done up properly. If you want to take this one step further, what you can do once the bolt has been correctly torqued up is to take a Tip-X or another like high contrast pen, draw a line through your bolt and its housing, and then it's all in line, and if you see that that line is broken, it means the bolt has begun to loosen. There's a certain noise and feeling you get when you reach the end of your suspension travel and bottom it out, and that's something to avoid. So if you do have too light a spring or not enough air pressure in your suspension, you find you reach the end of the travel before the sort of force has been dissipated for a landing impact or hitting something. That means that force gets transferred onto the suspension components, onto their mounting hardware, bearings and bushings and bolts, onto the suspension linkages of your frame and the rest of the frame, and through to you as well, and that can cause damage. So to avoid that bottoming out, starting with setting your suspension up within this recommended range of sag for the system weight you kit in your bike, using a manufacturer's recommended damping settings, thinking about how that aligns with your riding style, and if you still feel like you're bottoming out a lot, maybe thinking about moving to a heavier spring, more air, and using bottom out tokens in an air sprung fork to avoid this happening, avoid damaging everything and throwing yourself off. All the components of a chain wear out over time just through friction in the drivetrain, but there is a key part of it that does affect how it meshes with the whole system, and it's why people tend to talk about changing the chain regularly before it gets too worn out. And this is the rollers that sit in the joins in each link, so they sit around the pins and hold the chain together. As these rollers wear down, it creates more slop in the joins between each link, and it sort of increases the effective pitch or the length of each bit of chain. That means that when it curves sort of around a sprocket, it makes a slightly different curve, and that wears the cassette to fit that curve. So then if you replace it with a fresh chain with the original unworn rollers, the cassette is worn to a different shape, it doesn't mesh with this new chain, and then you get that horrible slipping. It means it's time for a new cassette. In order to avoid having to replace the whole drivetrain, maybe including the chainring, you can use a chain checking tool that measures the wear across an average of a number of links, and if you use that all around your chain, you can get a sense of the overall wear. Sort of slip that into the chain, make sure it hasn't worn excessively, and it lets you catch the wear, just change the chain before it gets worn out, keep the rest of the parts running smoothly, and they'll accept a new chain with no problems. Pretty much all the bearings you're going to find on a mountain bike these days are going to be the modern sealed cartridge type bearings. The days of cup and cone ball bearings are over, I'm sorry to say, and that means if they do develop play, there's often not that much you can do in terms of adjusting that out. This means keeping on top of the amount of dirt that works its way inside those bearings and can cause the rollers and everything to wear. So a lot of bearings, not all of them, but you can prise the seals off really carefully with like a pick or a knife blade, clean out the inside of the bearing and re-lubricate it in order to really try and prevent that wear that's going to mean the bearings start slopping around, running roughly and need replacing. As well as accelerating the wear on the bearings themselves, once they've got that looseness and slop, it can really impact the housings they sit in if you have that percussive shake in a bearing. So it could be things like the frame pivot bearings. Those might be mounted directly into the frame, and that's an expensive fix. As well as the internal cleaning and lubrication you use with grease inside the bearings to keep them running smoothly and preventing the wear, it is also something to think about greasing the outside. We talk about like greasing headsets and that kind of thing, and that isn't actually to lubricate the movement, but it's to use it as a protective layer to stop the penetration of moisture and some dirt getting into those bearings. So it is a balance, because if you put too much grease around somewhere, it can kind of attract dirt and get it to all stick in there, but it's just enough to stop water working its way in. Maybe on the bottom end of your head tube is a key place to make sure you're not getting moisture settling there in the bearings and causing them to rust. Disc brake pistons are a key access area for dirt, water, air, and everything you don't want in your hydraulic fluid actually getting into that system. So especially if riding in the rain a lot or pressure washing your bike, water can work its way in around the outside of the pistons where the seals are, into that fluid, and then begin contaminating it. So if you are bleeding your brakes, that's a key reason why you tend to find a lot more dirty hydraulic fluid down the bottom by the caliper. Up at the lever end, it's much more sealed off. They tend to stay clean. The dirt works its way up from the bottom of the system and then really impacts your brake performance. If your pads do wear right down, sort of requiring that piston to extend out through the seal in order to still contact the rotor properly, one thing you should do if you're replacing your pads or just in general really to stop that dirt working its way in, is to use some solvent like disc brake cleaner and some kind of little implement like a cotton bud. So work your way around the edge, the circumference of the pistons, cleaning off that dirt before it has a chance to cause any wear and work its way into the hydraulic fluids. Once you've cleaned those pistons, to get a nice sharp transfer of braking, you can lube the edges of them with the correct corresponding brake fluid for that brake, whether that's mineral oil or a dot fluid. Check that carefully with whatever brake you're using, but you can apply that around the edge of your piston, working that into the kind of the moving contact interface, but making sure that any excess fluid doesn't make it onto the surface of your brake pads. That'll contaminate them, start causing a whole different problem you didn't want. Suspension parts like fork stanchions and the air can of the rear shock can wear out over time as well, which is really exacerbated by abrasive dirt in the seals that those sit in. So keeping those clean, really just with water and maybe using a specific suspension lubricant can really help prevent that. Seals, they are almost a wear and tear part. They can be popped out and replaced during a lower service. This is a home job if you are confident with it and you take a bit of care. On the other hand, fork stanchions, if they do begin to get scored like these ones here, it can mean the end of the life of the forks. It is possible to get complete upper units, so the steerer tube, the crown and the stanchions come as one part. You can't always necessarily buy these as a retail part, but suspension servicing centres can sometimes order them for you from manufacturers, but I've tried to get these in the past and they're a kind of made to order part, especially, well, when I tried to get them, and it takes over 6 months, it's really expensive and it does require a complete rebuild of the fork. So really, I think at that point, you either can buy a new fork, which maybe saves time, but it is expensive, or if you've got a scratch rather than necessarily sort of even wear on the stanchions, you can see the video that Anna's done in terms of repairing stanchions. If you have that specific type of wear, it can get you out of jail. Hopefully that stops you destroying your mountain bike. I think most of the time it's a case of just staying on top of stuff and checking it regularly, but of course let me know if I have missed anything in the comments, and I really look forward to seeing you next time.